Thank you, Commissioners. I have one last question on the public trust topic that we were discussing before the break, and then I'll move on. Elle, if I can come back to you and the Halifax report. The subcommittee surveyed community members about their experiences with police and, as one would expect, received a range of responses from very positive to quite negative to very mixed. What have you learned from your work about the conditions that either foster or diminish public trust in police?
So as part of the report, we had a number of public engagements, and that included nearly 2,500 surveys from people in Halifax, which I do think might be the biggest data set on policing, perhaps in Canada. And of course, as you said, there was a wide range, people who strongly support the police, people who strongly don't support the police, and a lot of people that had varied thoughts. So they may, for example, want the police to be present for fighting crime, but agree that the police often also are involved in roles they shouldn't be, for example. So overall, I would say that, and to put it in the context of the Commission today, people understand, for example, that they would wish the police to be present and effective in events such as this one. If the police are perceived to be acting in a necessary way, in a proportionate way, in a way that maintains public safety, then largely people are going to understand that the police are necessary in that scenario, and also, of course, understand that the police have a difficult job, that they are going to experience trauma, that they may put their life on the line, and I think people are understanding of that. Where you see a breakdown of trust, particularly in racialized communities, but not solely, there are, of course, people in racialized communities that support the police. There are people in non-racialized communities that do not support police. There is no one narrative. People have many, many different orientations politically, many different desires, so we shouldn't generalize, but we do know from multiple surveys that overall Black people consistently for decades have testified to experiencing more police force and having less trust in the police, and that's through numerous reports. But where that really comes from is when people feel that it's disproportionate and unfair. So, for example, the feeling that Dr. Scott Wortley's recent report on use of force, for example, he pointed out that Black people rarely survive being shot by police, whereas white people do. So we know that the perception that Black people police more harshly, for example, that we end up experiencing force in ways that people that are being much more violent do not. Or, you know, if you have the Muslim community talking about being surveyed for terrorism and feeling that, you know, there's much more surveillance and criminalization and many more interventions, whereas then you have other situations where a white man may be radicalized and is not receiving any of the same police attention. So when people feel that the policing is disproportionate, it's being unfairly distributed to their community, that there is bias involved in that policing, and that they are not receiving a feeling of safety from that, and it's not, you know, promoting anything in their community, then that's where the trust really goes. Added to that is there are many studies that show that the more that police are disconnected from the communities they police, that does not build trust. So as opposed to, there are problems with community policing models, so I don't want to just come and say community policing, because there's also a lot of studies that show that community policing itself is much more accepted by white communities and racialized communities. But the more that people feel that the police are at least aware of their community, understand it, are seen within their community, aren't just coming as an outside force to police that community, those are things that really lead to the breakdown of how people experience policing. We saw a lot of commentary, for example, with the convoy in Ottawa, where a lot of communities of color were like, we can't do that, you know? So the recognition that everybody does not experience policing in the same way. And so one of the concerns, I suppose, is to make sure that obviously that there are the resources for when we have the kind of scenarios like a mass shooting scenario, that the police are able to deal with that. But the concern that often that doesn't actually effectively happen, and then there's a spill over into other communities that then experience the backlash. And I'll give just one current example. Many people right now from Uniacke Square are sending me photos of a tank that was used in the community to execute arrests. So there's been some gun violence in the community, and people are traumatized already from that, and then feel that rather than receiving help or resources, or, you know, the police being able to deal with that scenario, what they get now is a tank in the middle of their community. People were pulled out in their underwear. That further traumatized the community. It's further broken trust, and people are very, very upset and feel powerless about that. So that's an example where something, an instrument of force that was supposed to be used for things like, I mean, particularly post Justin Bork, where people said, well, the police didn't have protection, we need these vehicles, and now are being used to execute a warrant in a Black community, right? So that sense of disproportionality and the sense that no matter what Black communities do, we end up perceiving the heavy brunt of policing that makes us more unsafe, makes us unable to deal with our own problems in our community, leaves us completely vulnerable to criminalization, and that's where you see the breakdown. But overall, I would say yes, that people do expect the police to be able to do their job when it comes to engaging with crime, and especially in these particularly high like these critical response incidents. But people do not want to see that same kind of violence or same kind of energy brought to everyday interactions, such as policing people who are unhoused or policing people who are intoxicated in public, and want to see that pulled back. So really, it's a principle of fairness, proportionality, reasonableness, and necessity. And if people see those in place, they're much more accepting of the idea that the police have a difficult job to do and those sacrifices will be made, but to understand that it was done carefully and not just done out of racial bias or out of other forms of unfair policing.
Thank you. And Elle, if I can just confirm the Scott Wortley study.